All right, we are going to go ahead and get started this evening. Good evening, everybody. Thank you all so much for joining us live or potentially watching recorded. My name is Pat Kane, Public Programs Manager with the Champaign County Forest Preserve District's Museum and Education Department. And we are here tonight to continue our special speaker series. And in just a few short moments, I will bring on David McBride to present tonight's program, The Health and Equality Ideals Through the Lens of History and Preservation. Before we get into tonight's program, I just wanted to go over a few things before we get started. First, joining us on screen right now is Janie. Janie will be providing American Sign Language interpretation for tonight's program. And we thank Janie so much for being here. Also, let us know where you're watching from this evening, whether you're watching from Central Illinois, across the state of Illinois, across the country, or somewhere else. Always like to see where folks are tuning in from, so jot down in the comment section where you may be watching this program from. It would be greatly appreciated. If you don't know anything about the Museum of the Grand Prairie or the Champaign County Forest Preserve District, the museum opened originally in 1968 as the Early American Museum, and our current mission is to collect, preserve, and interpret the cultural and natural history of Champaign County and East Central Illinois for all. We're an accredited institution with the American Alliance of Museums, and we're also part of the Champaign County Forest Preserve District, which is a collection of 7 forest preserves, 2 educational facilities, including our facility and the Homer Lake Interpretive Center at Homer Lake Forest Preserve. It also includes Lake of the Woods Golf Course, a multi-purpose Kickapoo Rail Trail, and a whole bunch more. In fulfillment of our district's mission to protect Champaign County's natural and cultural resources and inspire people to care for, enjoy, and explore their natural world, the Champaign County Forest Preserve District recognizes its responsibility to acknowledge those Native peoples who came before us on this land. We currently work to preserve and tell the story of the lands of the Peoria, Kaskaskia, Wea, Miami, Kickapoo, and Potawatomi nations. Native Americans shaped the landscape that the Forest Preserve District sits within, and we must recognize that the forest preserves occupy the ancestral, traditional, and contemporary lands of the peoples previously mentioned. They were the first stewards of the land, and it's necessary for us to acknowledge these Native nations, to work with them, and to continue to steward the land and educate the public with honor and respect. CCFPD will work to be inclusive of all differences and keep Native peoples and their history at the core of our efforts. Tonight's program is one of many programs tied to our special exhibit, A History of Healing, Infectious Diseases, and Community Responses to Defeat Them. This exhibit opened in last May and focuses on the local and worldwide impact of such diseases as the 1918 flu, smallpox, malaria, tuberculosis, polio, typhoid, cholera, HIV, AIDS, and COVID-19. In addition to looking at the impact disease has had on our health and well-being, the exhibit highlights particular instances in the past as well as the present where local citizens came together during previous epidemics and pandemics for the betterment of their communities. We encourage you all to check out past virtual programs within the speaker series. You can find those recordings on our Facebook and YouTube pages. And if you're local, we encourage you to come visit the special exhibit at our museum. The museum is currently closed as typical during the months of January and February, but we will reopen on March 1st for spring hours, where we are open every day from 1 to 5 p.m. Also want to let you know about a few other programs coming up, some guest presenters coming to the museum. We are beginning our annual Garden Speaker Series next month in March, and we'll kick off our annual Garden Speaker Series with a special virtual program. Megan Romberg, a mycologist at the U.S. Department of Agriculture, will present the program titled One of the Fungal Final Frontiers, filling in the gaps on our knowledge of North American microfungi and how you can help. This program will be virtual and will stream on our Facebook and YouTube pages. Also, next month, we're looking to start a new program at the Museum of the Grand Prairie. I'm looking to start a museum docent program. And we encourage all of those who are local who would love to maybe pass on your passion for history to others by joining us for a docent workshop and training on Saturday, March 25th at the Museum of the Grand Prairie in Mahomet, Illinois from 2 to 4 p.m. During that training session, you can learn how to become a museum docent and lead tour groups through museum exhibits, receive an outline of the docent program, exhibit study sources, and a whole bunch of tips and tricks to lead a successful museum tour. Also going to be hosting another training in April, and you can find more information about that training, as well as more information about all that the Museum of the Grand Prairie and CCFPD has to offer by visiting museumofthegrandprairie.org or ccfpd.org. Should you have any questions or comments tonight, feel free to drop those in the comments section. We will have a Q&A session at the end of the program. All right, enough of me talking tonight. Let's bring on our guest for this evening, David. David, how you doing?
I'm good.
Hey, David, I want to thank you so much for joining us tonight. I think the silver lining with the pandemic is it provided an opportunity for us to provide virtual programs to folks. Not only folks can tune in from across the country, but it also provides an opportunity to have guest presenters from across the country. So really thank you for being here with us virtually, having the opportunity to speak with us tonight. Let me introduce David, and then I will turn the show over to him. Dr. David McBride is a public historian who focuses on health, historic preservation, and Black and minority communities. His writings and research include several major books and research studies on medical history of the U.S., African American health, epidemics, and disasters. Dr. McBride is Professor Emeritus of African American History and Studies at Pennsylvania State University in University Park, Pennsylvania. He received his BA from Denison University in Greenville, Ohio, and his PhD from Columbia University in New York. So without further ado, let's give a warm virtual welcome to David McBride.
Thank you. Can you guys hear me well?
Yes, sir.
Yeah, I'm happy to address everyone, and I appreciate Pat did a lot of work behind the scenes for the last couple of weeks to make this program happen. So what I want to do is take you all through material and themes that are covered in a couple of my books. One book is From TB to AIDS, which I wrote some years ago, and I wrote it in the throes of the HIV epidemic back in the 90s. And then a more recent book, Caring for Equality, which has come out rather recently, and it covers a lot of the themes and issues and things that I'll talk about today. So you're going to get a summation. If you have an interest in a particular detail, or you want to pursue some reading on a topic or person or event that I cover, you can track down those books and from your libraries, ebook form or whatever, and they have extensive bibliographies and recommended readings and such. I was telling Pat a couple of days ago that I'm familiar with Champaign County, not recently, but I spent my early career out at Sangamon State University, which is now University of Illinois at Springfield. So I was being in the capital of Illinois. I was in the middle of a lot of interesting events, and I got exposed to the famous Illinois politics, and it was a great experience. So I'm very happy to be back in a way with you guys to talk about this issue of healthy and equality ideals. If I could have my slides. Okay, what we're going to do is focus on 4 or 5 key periods in the history of African American health and medical care, and the interface of that subject with the foundational principles of our nation, 2 of which focus on equality and liberty. And I want to show how these two aspects of American society, that is the movement of the improvement and modernization of health on one hand, and the improvement and widening of civil rights on the other hand. I want to show how these two impulses intertwine. Okay, next slide. Here are the two books I mentioned, From TB to AIDS, which I wrote to cover the period from 1900 through the 1990s, when AIDS was really peaking throughout the nation. And then the other book that I mentioned is Caring for Equality, and that comes down through 2018. And again, what I'm going to describe today they're encompassed in these two works and other works that I've done over time. So what do we mean with this title that has health and equality, ideal in it? Well, my central theme is that constitutional principles of liberty and equality, I'm arguing, have been the driving forces behind today's modern medical system. And the way we study medical history, it generally is separate from the civil rights heritage and vice versa. The way we tend to study and approach and historicize civil rights is we tend to leave out a lot of what's going on in the health area and the impact that civil rights is having on healthcare and improving the health of the American people. So that's what we want to focus on throughout these next 20 minutes or so. What I'm arguing is that the differences in disease patterns, epidemic impacts, the availability of medical care, as the nation has rifts and inequalities in these different realms, what happens is the American institutions are constantly kind of widening and trying to embrace and contain and then even eliminate these types of inequalities. And then as a kind of secondary theme or dimension of my talk is how has this health equality ideal experience become memorialized in terms of our monuments and in terms of the way we approach our historical sites and cultural materials. So we're going to go through 3 or 4 periods: the post-Reconstruction period, the Jim Crow segregation period, the civil rights period, and then the period of urban crisis, which pertains to the 1980s, 90s, early 2000s, and then right down to our current experience with the COVID-19 pandemic. Next slide. So putting our kind of like time capsule together and going back to around 1900, one of the major causes of death throughout the nation, and especially for Black Americans, is tuberculosis. And it had ravaged Europe in the 18th century and come into 19th century. It comes into America in the 19th century heavily. And then in the early 20th century, it's still one of the leading causes of death across the board. And the rates of death and morbidity for Blacks is significantly higher for whites. One of the famous figures in our history who succumbs to tuberculosis, along with many other people of celebrity, is Paul Laurence Dunbar, the American poet. He suffered from tuberculosis, and he ultimately dies at a young age from the disease. Next slide. There you go. And this is a poem by Laurence Dunbar, and I think he wrote it near to the year of his death. It's been periodized as 1906, but it's very distressful and and morbid. And just reading a couple of the lines, it's actually called "What's the Use?" What's the use of folks a frowning when the ways a little rough? Frowns lay out the road for smiling. You'll be wrinkled soon enough. What's the use? And then that last verse, what's the use of even weeping? I might as well go long and smile. Life, our longest, strongest arrow, only lasts a little while. So what's the use? And shortly after he writes this poem, Dunbar, succumbs to tuberculosis. If you go to Dayton, you'll see his home has been made a National Historic Site, and this is a plaque you'll see in front of the home. And what's not mentioned though, and I don't think it's in the inscription, is that tuberculosis epidemic was pretty much raging across the country at that time. So these health problems, these health crises, disasters, like tuberculosis and other communicable diseases, they trigger philanthropy, they trigger social movements, and they trigger educational institution building. And one example that appears right after the Civil War is the establishment and the growth of Friedman's Hospital in Washington, D.C. Now, Friedman's had originally been established to treat the sick refugees from Civil War, soldiers and the like, and in the 1860s. And over time, it became part of the Howard University educational complex. It became a stable and always enlarging kind of hospital where Howard University fosters its medical school and its nursing school and other related medical areas. Next. And this is Friedman's Hospital today. Actually, again, it's been incorporated into Howard University complex and the Howard University Hospital complex. So now I want you to see these photos of Friedman, because you can see the changes are obvious, physical changes, but we also have to look a little deeper in the history books to realize that Friedman's was in response to, again, a military crisis, and then the horrific kinds of disease problems that the freed people faced and the Civil War veterans faced after the Civil War conflict. So we're seeing this rise in help of self-help and philanthropy centered on improving the health of the Negro, as blacks were referred to at the time, 1900, 1910. And we're moving into that period of Jim Crow segregation. This is a photo of Booker T. Washington, and he's standing alongside Andrew Carnegie, William Howard Taft. I believe Taft is a vice president at this time, and Mr. Ogden, who I believe was an educational philanthropist. And next slide. This group was symbolic of the evolution of Tuskegee Institute down in Macon County, Alabama. Tuskegee, as probably most of you all know who know American history, we know that Tuskegee Institute became one of the central cornerstones of higher education for blacks in the South, for the newly freed black populations, and it becomes a center for Booker T. Washington's idea of focusing on education that stresses vocational trades, practical sciences, but also the professions such as as medicine and nursing and related fields of architecture and such. So here are some photos of Tuskegee Institute. Here's a chemistry lab around 1902, when the institute is up 2 or 3 decades old. And here's a math class around the same time of the century, and you could see the young ladies in the front, and in the back you have young men, and they're learning some essential math subjects around. It was around 1906 or so. Now, to provide health care for the students and staff down at Tuskegee, a hospital was established, a health center, and it was called the John A. Andrew Memorial Hospital. It was built in 1913. It was a hospital before that, but the one that we're focusing on is the 1913 onward version of that health center. And the Memorial Hospital that was built in 1913, it's named after John A. Andrew. He has a connection to the Civil War. Next slide. Andrew is a Civil War governor of Massachusetts, and one of his descendants, I believe a granddaughter, is the one who oversaw the building of the John Andrew Memorial Hospital at Tuskegee Institute. Now, it's interesting. He's obviously a white man who had deep roots in the Civil War abolitionist cause. It was his state that was the center for the organization of the 54th Regiment, which drew free black males from throughout the North to go and fight in the Civil War. So in any case, the hospital is named in honor of the memory of John A. Andrew. Next slide. And here's a scene from the new hospital. This is a award, and you can see nurses rendering care. Next slide. Now, what's interesting about the Andrew Memorial Hospital is how it evolved over the decades. And here's again where you need to put on a historical cap, and also think about the ebbs and flows of the struggle for the public struggles for civil rights and liberty. And the Andrew Hospital today is called the Andrew Building, and it is the National Center for Bioethics in Healthcare and Research. Next slide. Another hospital that emerged in the early 1900s to meet the needs of the health problems that blacks faced was Provident Hospital in Chicago. And Provident Hospital was founded by Daniel Hale Williams, who was the famous black surgeon that felt the need for to expand medical and nursing education, and so to have a place where people could learn the different medical arts. He helped to have a Provident Hospital established, and it had a very strong nursing school. And over the years, this hospital remains a very important part of the black medical world that begins to emerge behind the Jim Crow curtain. Since blacks were not allowed in many, if not most, of the medical programs that had internships, and similarly with the nurses, we see the development of Black hospitals around the country. I would say over 100, and these hospitals are in all the, all the different states where you have Black populations throughout the South, Midwest, Northeast, and they become the training grounds for the Black medical profession, which includes Black nurses and doctors, surgeons, and the like. Next slide. This slide shows you how the hospital structure changed over time, from the 1890s with funds and campaigns and philanthropic contributions. You see Provident Hospital moves in different parts of Chicago, and by the 1930s, it's kind of like a high rise, and it looks to be quite modernized. Next slide. This is Provident Hospital today, and it's called Provident Hospital of Cook County, and you can see that from the small brownstone to very large modern complex. You can see the history has moved this impulse that Daniel Hale Williams had. He has changed it from just a small dream into a very strong part of our current society. Okay, next slide. Interesting to me, as someone who has an interest in historic preservation, I don't know if there's a historical plaque on Provident Hospital, but there is one for Daniel Hale Williams in a little town in Pennsylvania, not far from where I live here in State College. And this is a historic marker in honor of Daniel Hale Williams, boyhood home, a Black physician who pioneered successful heart surgery, 1893. Founded Provident Hospital, chief surgeon, Friedman's Hospital, charter member of the College of Surgeons. Interesting that Daniel Hale Williams had a connection to Friedman's, and as we mentioned earlier in our talk, Friedman's Hospital was kind of a hub for training of Black physicians and people who would become leaders in the Black medical institutional networks in later decades in the early 20th century and down through through World War II. Now, while we had philanthropy and self-reliance and kind of like community-oriented institution building going on behind the Jim Crow curtain of segregation, American medicine, in terms of its middle stream medicine, in terms of this standard profession, was still strongly impacted by and wedded to what historians call scientific racism. That is, where you had different branches of science. You had scientists within these evolving branches. They really believed that they had scientific evidence that proved that Blacks were constitutionally inferior to white races, and that therefore Blacks were succumbing to disease more rapidly than their white counterparts. And this book here, Race Traits and Tendencies, exemplifies this kind of intelligentsia that had a strong control over a lot of the medical profession during the time of Jim Crow. So you had these building blocks that made up the Jim Crow wall. It wasn't just the building block of economic barriers, such as keeping Blacks within certain professions or certain occupations or in debt in the economic realm, but also in the educational realm and in the realm of science. There was a lot of tendencies and production with respect to scientific racism. And Frederick Hoffman wrote this study in the turn of the century, and it was widely cited as the reason as the rationale and the evidence for what many people believed would be the end of the Negro race. And Hoffman was a German-born statistician who came over to the States. I'm sure he was brilliant in his particular vocation, and he was very influential in terms of the insurance companies and demographics and social sciences. But his conclusions and such with regard to race traits and tendencies turned out to be pretty much absolutely wrong, and they were challenged by Black and progressive intellectuals as soon as this particular study came out. But still, the influence of these studies of so-called scientific racism was pretty pervasive during the Jim Crow period. So what does this have to do with the health equality ideal? Well, it's a barrier. It's a preventative to the idea that people should and could have equal health status if they had equal access to healthcare provision. Next slide. This is a page out of one of the medical journals of the Jim Crow period, and it's the American Tuberculosis Review. And I show this just to remind everyone that before our computer age and before the digital digitization of so much of our knowledge base, we used journals, physically preserved and available through medical libraries and such. And if you were a practitioner or a researcher back during the time of Jim Crow or the 1930s and Great Depression era, all the way down through the modern, the latter 20th century, you relied on these highly specialized journals. And this is the American Tuberculosis Review. And what this page talks about is that something's happening with the Negro. So and the person writing it is he's a reputable tuberculosis specialist down in North Carolina, and they're having a conference, and he's writing about how they are noticing that the Negro is not becoming extinct. The Negro is actually surviving, and they're beginning to turn back the tide of tuberculosis deaths. Next slide. And to counter scientific racism, to counter the apathy with respect to trying to prevent and eliminate the high death rates that Blacks were experiencing, Booker T. Washington helped found the National Negro Health Week movement, which he did in the latter years of his life. And what that became was a yearly focus throughout the country on where you set aside a week and it became a month. You set aside this period every year to focus on community health, focusing on health issues, preventive health programming, campaigns, school programs, things that communities could do to promote health. And so this was a counter on the scale of the scientific racism that I covered. Next slide. So we come out of the Jim Crow period. We have the segregated medical system, but still it's becoming restless in terms of the nation as a whole. And as we all know, in the 1950s, the civil rights movement begins to explode throughout the country. Some of the highlights are spelled out on this particular slide. The Imhotep movement was a collection of Black physicians who worked with the NAACP, National Medical Association, and the Black Medical Society of the District of Columbia. And what they do is they begin to challenge the American Medical Association about segregation. The federal courts and the federal agencies begin to push the medical establishment through, push them more and more to let down the walls of segregation. And one of the key cases is the Simpkins Memorial Hospital case, a federal case that emerges out of North Carolina. And that case became one of the important how can I say, milestones that resulted in hospitals in the South that were using federal money. They were being required by federal agencies to allow Blacks to use their facilities both as patients and as medical professionals. So the separate but equal idea or practice begins to erode with decisions such as the Simpkins decision. And then we have the Medical Committee for Human Rights, which is founded. Again, these are progressive physicians and people in the medical fields who, Black and white, who begin to support the civil rights movement and move throughout the South and begin to knock down barriers in terms of the segregation in the different professional specialties and in medical institutions. Next slide. Lyndon Johnson initiates the war on poverty. Medicaid and Medicare are implemented. These are explosive developments. Medicaid and Medicare begin to knock down barriers in all of the hospitals because these patients had federal monies, and the hospitals, if they segregated, they were kept out of these programs. So hospitals began to, across the South, and where there had been customary segregation in the North, these hospitals and medical schools and such began to let down the walls of segregation. Next slide. Here's a photo of the Medical Committee for Civil Rights. I mentioned them a little earlier, a few slides back, but they evolve into the Medical Committee for Human Rights, and they're important in terms of forcing the AMA to desegregate. They're important in terms of providing medical assistance to the civil rights workers in the South, who were down during the time of voter registration drives and protests protests regarding other avenues of public life. Well, the Medical Committee for Human Rights would dispatch volunteer physicians, medical students, nurses to give assistance to these civil rights workers. But in addition, they work to push the walls of segregation down in the profession of medicine and nursing. Next slide. We know there have been a couple of books now on the Black Panther Party and their free health centers that they set up. And so you have a kind of nationalist branch within this broader movement to knock down walls of segregation and disadvantage with regard to healthcare in the urban areas, in the so-called inner cities. Next slide. When we get out of the period of civil rights, which is I periodize as 1960s, 70s, and early 80s, we move into a phase where the nation focuses on health disparities, and then that HIV/AIDS epidemic comes to bear. Next slide. One of the important figures in the development of federal government's attention to health disparities, because realize Jim Crow had been prohibited now because of these federal programs, because of the major decisions, the Simpkins decision, Brown versus Board, etc. But what the agencies noticed was there were still very significant disparities between Blacks and other minorities on one hand, and middle class and upper class white populations on the other. And Margaret Sackler, she noticed this difference when she said, and if you read her memoirs and such, she said when she met with the heads of the different agencies under the Health and Human Services, she would always get reports that there were these big discrepancies in terms of the health levels for Blacks and other minorities compared to whites. Next slide. So what she did was she commissioned a study, and she had all of the different heads report to her with regard to the various areas of health and healthcare and the racial disparities that existed. And she felt that this study would be a kind of benchmark, a kind of like a platform upon which the federal government could begin to address directly this problem of health disparities. And so the famous Heckler Report was published in 1985, and this to this day is still important in terms of being a prototype for later studies that are done by federal agencies and national research entities to put a spotlight on disparities and to share ways of trying to remedy these disparities. Next slide. During the era of AIDS, we have Surgeon Generals such as Jocelyn Elders, Antonio Novella, C. Everett Koop. Some of us might remember some of these names, and they took the lead in dealing with the HIV epidemic and also in trying to forge resources, programming, practices, policies that would lower the barriers to healthcare access for the low income, but also that would lessen and reduce the health disparities and healthcare disparities. So we're seeing the federal government is no longer like 100 years ago, where you had a government that supported Jim Crow hospitals, that supported neglecting the so-called Negro because of that was the way that they tended to lean as the medical and scientific establishment embraced different tenets of scientific racism. Instead of having that, by the time we get to the HIV/AIDS era, we see the health equality ideal really pretty widespread, and advocates coming from all different directions and with different positions and places within the complex healthcare establishment that we have now. Next slide. A very interesting story that comes out of this coming together of science and progressive ways of addressing these health crises. Interesting story is a story of Irvin Magic Johnson and Dr. David Ho. And we, looking at the history of how the nation responded to HIV and AIDS, we might remember the story of Magic Johnson and how he was a great NBA professional basketball player, and he was discovered to have HIV. And at that time, in the early 90s, in the 1990s, it was considered pretty much a death sentence to have been found to be positive for HIV. Well, Dr. David Ho, he was instrumental in coming up with this idea, this therapy involving the so-called cocktail regimen of drugs that minimize the impact of HIV infection. And it was discovered that if it was applied over time, that HIV could be managed. And so what we see is a remarkable story of how Magic Johnson not only survives HIV, but he leaves a permanent kind of stamp on society to help prevent and fight HIV in the future. Next slide. He has headed the Magic Johnson Foundation, and this is of interest to us again as preservationists. This is a kind of like an indicator of some deep steps and tracks that are being put in our society that will be there as the kind of like the critical and public awareness of HIV subsides in future decades. Next slide. Interestingly enough, there are not a lot of markers, historic markers, that focus on AIDS throughout the country. This is a set of markers that do exist. One is this mural over there on the left side of the screen. That's painting on the building that was an AIDS library in Philadelphia. And during the time of HIV, when it first hit and people were, in a panic stage, and it was much ignorance, and people were stigmatizing and shunning those with the problem. Well, there was a small library that had amassed some information for the people to access and learn more about AIDS. And so on your right, you see a historic marker, and the city of Philadelphia and some private group, I believe, is responsible for that marker. Next slide. So my final point is that the cultural materials and monuments relating to the health equality ideal have taken many forms and shapes, and from community to community and from state to state. Now, as the COVID-19 pandemic subsides, we can learn a lot from these past struggles that our society has had with these health crises, and learn how America does its best when it combines both its civil rights heritage with its abilities and resources with regard to healthcare. So hopefully, this landscape of monuments relating to healthcare achievements and opening up of health health opportunities for the American people. Hopefully, this landscape of monuments and markers will expand over time as we try to recover from the COVID-19 experience. So that's pretty much what I think. I would like to say, and I'm very open to hearing comments and questions. And again, most of what I covered is detailed very thoroughly, and I would say in the books that I mentioned. Oh, gotta unmute yourself. There you go.
Sorry about that. You would think I would know by now after doing this for several years. But thank you very much. You covered quite a bit of history in a short amount of time, spanning all the way from Civil War and bringing us, right up to now. So appreciate that. Covered quite a few subjects as well. So thank you so much. If you do have a question, feel free to jot it in the comments. Can answer those here at the end of the program. One question that came in before tonight in one of the promotional materials, somebody commented on, and you talked a little bit about Medicare and Medicaid during the civil rights movement in the 1960s, but could you talk a little bit more about the influence of national healthcare system and the single payer movement and what influence that had?
Sure. National health care movement goes back to the 30s. Many of the progressive organizations in the different medical professions have been pushing for national health insurance. It's definitely not a new fly-by-night idea. Again, you can find advocates for national health insurance back during the time of the New Deal, and I think that deals had to be struck whereby we got partial national health insurance, which in the form of, again, Medicaid, Medicare, Social Security. These had great impacts on health levels. We see life expectancy increase. We see reduction in many areas of, child mortality and maternal mortality because of these federal programs. But when you're getting to the national health insurance issue, that is a real hot wire. It was advocated heavily in the 1980s in the Jesse Jackson campaign. That was one of its key platforms. And so in a book format, you cannot leave out national health insurance movements. It's been there and it always comes to the table, but it runs into problems because of the kind of like it's a very broad kind of total. It would require a broad total overhaul of the American health system. And what I really want to stress is that the pragmatic civil rights movements, they leave lasting changes in this huge complex that we call the healthcare establishment. So, but it definitely deserves a chapter in any book on the movement to expand the health equality ideal. And I'm glad that someone raised that, in the in context of this particular program.
Thanks, David. You talked about there at the end, it's still sort of remains to be seen how our current historical moment in response to the COVID-19 pandemic, how that will be memorialized. Are you talking about you showed like historical markers and more permanent sort of structures? Are you talking about, things such as that, or just memorialization in general? Because, for example, at our museum, and I know there's some other local museums in our area, and potentially maybe even, out your way in Pennsylvania, we did some collecting of artifacts and stories and photographs and archival material that sort of illustrates the experience of the COVID-19 pandemic, and some of those are on display within our History of Healing exhibit in the COVID-19 section. Would you consider that some sort of memorialization, and also, do you know of any out in Pennsylvania, or did museums in your area, do something similar and sort of a community collecting initiative so we can hold on to these stories and maybe tell them for, once this exhibit comes down, these objects that are on display will continue to be within our museum's collection, and should somebody far into the future want to, bring these back out for exhibit, the hope is that they will be there either for exhibit or for research or whatever else. So that was a long, drawn out question, but
no, I think your heart and your mind is in a very important place. But we all would agree that COVID-19 is so fresh as an event. It's not even wrapped up yet. We don't even know, if it's finally, in the trash bin. So I did do a quick canvas, of research avenues and different resources to try to see just how COVID-19 is being memorialized. And I think I found one place, and I believe it's in St. Louis, where they have set up like a stone where it's engraved stone that honors the first responders who lost their lives to COVID-19. So we cannot expect, and this almost goes without saying, but we're still in the throes of this. I just mentioned COVID-19 as possibly something that we should consider memorializing in a way that's more total and effective and vibrant than, like I was suggesting, with tuberculosis. I mean, you don't find a lot about tuberculosis in the historical markers and things, but it's a very important chapter in American history. And if we knew more about what happened to America and how it recovered and survived the tuberculosis crisis, maybe we would be a little stronger when we get confronted by such things as COVID-19. So COVID-19 is so fresh; it's still current. There's nothing to memorialize yet, but I think it's going to happen. And let's hope that we do use historical consciousness more frequently. I lament just how quick these events are flushed away from our minds. And I know part of it is we want to get bad thoughts and disasters behind us. We want to move forward. We're happy things are, on the right track. But it's amazing just how little history we see, throughout our society in so many ways, shapes, and forms. So COVID-19, hopefully we do remember, the key things about COVID and the people who sacrificed and the compromises that were reached. And we also are still in a period where we have a tussle as to who did what and who are the heroes. So all that has to be sifted out. But I think we can do it well better, more efficiently, and more humanistically if we consider the historical dimension.
Oh, certainly. Looking at, as you mentioned throughout your presentation, and the responses to previous epidemics and pandemics, paved the way for, quite a few things. Here in Illinois, during the height of tuberculosis, it paved the way for legislation to be passed here in the state of Illinois that would go on to create public health districts and public health departments, and pave. Shortly thereafter, that legislation was passed. Our local public health district opened up, and that's in response to that height of that tuberculosis pandemic. So, and that's just one of several sort of outcomes and responses to that sort of
Yeah,
thing.
I think what you say is so interesting because if we had that kind of background information about tuberculosis, if that was more in the foreground, we would be a little more patient and maybe a little more faithful when we get hit with with something like COVID-19. This again, it's not the first time that we've faced epidemics in this country. We've had them since the inception of the country. I could have started this talk going back to the yellow fever epidemic of the 1793 when Benjamin Rush, and he works with the black leaders and things. I mean, they were tied together by their unified willingness to take on a common enemy, and the common enemy was yellow fever. And so, jumping forward to COVID-19, it would be great if we knew more about these lessons from history, and the ways that the communities and physicians and schools and agencies, how they come together to build lasting types of ways to help people in real serious needs, such as tuberculosis people, victims of 100 years ago.
Yeah, disease is horrible, but it's historically quite a community builder. That's for sure.
Yeah.
One other question I have, it's somewhat related, but I guess more personal. I always like just to see what motivates folks and what motivates presenters, and to get into this field and to study these subjects. So what motivated you to get into this field and study these subjects? The history of public health, particularly how African Americans have been marginalized throughout much of pretty much all American history. So,
well, I had an interest in history as an undergrad, and several people in my family went on to medical school or nursing school, and I didn't like the clinical side of medicine. But I also noticed that there were these a lot of roads led to health issues and medical issues, a lot of historical roads. So when I did a book on, I did my dissertation on the history of blacks in the hospitals of Philadelphia. And the reason why I picked that subject was because I found that a lot of the black labor in the Philadelphia hospitals had been service workers in other occupations, other economic sectors. So when you look at history of medicine and history of hospitals, you actually are looking at various aspects of history, of conventional history, but in a very, very important and different way, in a way in which you are focusing on medical science and focusing on the medical establishment. So I got into focusing on medical history and health history as a graduate student, looking at urban health institutions and how they developed over time. And I was very interested in the concrete outcomes of the scientific field and changes in race relations, changes in the urban context, changes in the social context. So it's just it was a very, very exciting area for me to focus on, and that's why I focus on this, on this area of study.
Thanks for that, David. Should you have any questions or comments out there, jot those down. We're getting close to the end. I have one more here. Another one I like to ask is, should viewers want to learn more, do you have any recommendations for books, websites, archives, museums, etc. to explore? I know you mentioned your two books, at the beginning, and pretty extensively covered a lot of the subjects you have tonight in those books. But you have any others or other sorts of resources that you recommend folks explore?
Well, if you go to the National Library of Medicine's website, they have all types of menus, related to historical studies. So if there's a particular a medical ailment or a particular disease and you want to explore the history of it, you can definitely start with the National Library of Medicine website, and you'll just go down a rabbit hole of findings in just about every area. A great book, if I had to pick one book on the history of medicine, the history of hospitals, civil rights, progressivism, all of these things we're talking about, it's a book by Herbert Morais, Morais. It came out in around 1970, but it's a great book for anyone to grab from your library. Get it interlibrary loan if you want. But it's called the Negro in Medicine, something like that. The Negro in Medicine. But this book, it's rich with photos. It covers the civil rights movement in American medicine, and it's just so well done, and it's so accessible to all types of readers, including advanced researchers, all the way, if you're a history buff and you want to know about the history of American medicine and civil rights, this is the book to pick. And I've had one or two copies, and I just wear it out because it's filled with the real kind of like raw history that underlies the our contemporary history. But that would be one of the main books I would shoot to find. Herbert Morais is The Negro in Medicine. And it has a lot of citations and such in the back that can lead you into doing more research. And this particularly if you're looking at the 1800s, the early 1900s. You're a history buff. For the modern phase, National Library of Medicine, you would not run out of opportunities to find so much material from the National Library of Medicine. There's millions of citations. See, that's why I think the historians need to step forward and try to get a grip on this area of health and medicine. It combined medical activities make up 1/5 of the American economic system. So you'd be surprised. Medical history is just a tiny little aspect of American history overall. So there is a need for people to look at in more depth the health history of the country and the history of medicine, and then again, finally, to memorialize the high points and to give us more confidence and more foresight as we move forward into this world that we live in.
Well, thank you for that, David. Thanks for those recommendations and
it's
words in your presentation here.
But your librarians can track it down, and you'll love it. Anyone who gets it, it's full with illustrations and stories and all of the big names of people. The big name people you need to know. So I would always recommend that book, Negro in Medicine.
Yeah. All right. Well. It's a little after 8 here, so I think we'll call it a night here. So just wanted to again say thank you so much, David, for an extensive presentation covering a wide variety of topics here and such a large amount of history in a short time, fielding some questions here at the end. It's out on the East Coast, getting kind of late for you all out there, so I appreciate you taking time out of your evening to spend it with us. Jane, thank you for being here. As well. And thanks to everybody for watching. Thanks for tuning in. Hope everybody enjoys the rest of your evening here. Marina is chiming in to say thank you as well. And so is Nancy. Thank you. So I echo that. Thank you all so much. David, Janie, for myself. Until next time, we'll see everybody. Have a good night.
Take care, everybody.